The West's economic sanctions against Russia are widely regarded as low-cost, low-risk. For policymakers in Washington and Brussels, both smart, targeted sanctions and the devastating, widespread economic measures leveled in response to the Kremlin's mounting aggression towards Ukraine offer alternatives to the costs of military force. They can be calibrated to hurt key members of Putin's regime or dialed up to pressure Russian society writ large. Yet, to date, they have exacted mounting pain while delivering little strategic gain in terms of explicitly discouraging, arresting, or reversing Russia's aggressive posture. Similarly, Russia's counter-sanctions have failed to diffuse political pressure or drive a wedge between Western partners. In short, economic punishment from both sides failed to avert war and to manage escalation since. Moreover, the sustained disconnect between sanctions' impact and success has been met with mutual complacency about associated risks.
Often lost in the popular debate over the calculus and metrics of success are the indirect strategic consequences of sanctions. In this video, we will review divergent Western and Russian postures toward sanctions and the nature of war, and the dangers that they present for precipitating unexpected trajectories of escalation. Misunderstanding these differences can blur assessments of the impact of sanctions, rendering them not only ineffective but risky, if not menacing, for future Euro-Atlantic security. Meanwhile, a deeper understanding of the scope, contending visions, and implications of the unintended dimensions to the current sanctions tangle can help to illuminate off-ramps to reinforce a ceasefire once it materializes between Kiev and Moscow, and to put in place guardrails for the long-term competition that is taking shape between the West and Moscow.
Both the frequency and intensity of reciprocal sanctions between the US, EU, and Russia increased following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 up to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. During this period, the US and EU threatened and imposed successive rounds of sanctions aimed at select Kremlin cronies, security chiefs, and oligarchs, denied access to international capital markets for big Russian companies across the financial, defense, and energy sectors, introduced export controls on dual-use goods, and banned companies from conducting business in Crimea and from exporting specific oil drilling technologies. In 2017, the US Congress codified sanctions on Russia that required legislative approval to remove individuals and companies from designated lists. It also considered bills calling for the imposition of more severe restrictions. Russia countered with successive bans on imports of agricultural goods from the EU. Despite economic pressure, the specific damage smart sanctions inflicted on Russia was drowned out by the drop in world oil prices and the subsequent economic dislocation caused by the global COVID-19 pandemic. With the onset of Russia's military invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there was a shift from threatening and imposing targeted Western sanctions to enacting unprecedented economic warfare in conjunction with deepening military assistance to Ukraine. The punitive steps were marked by expanding individual sanctions, blocking the completion of the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline, freezing Russian central bank foreign reserves, cutting off select Russian banks from the International Financial Communications Network, SWIFT, and imposing widespread international trade, technology, and transportation restrictions. Furthermore, over 1,000 foreign private companies either suspended business operations in Russia or pulled out of the country entirely. The immediate impact of the dramatic economic and financial rupture was painful but not debilitating for Russia. Despite an initial 50% drop in the value of the ruble, a credit payment default, and a near-complete disruption of domestic production in key sectors, such as the automotive industry, Moscow weathered the initial storm. The Kremlin boosted revenues with the diversification and discount of foreign oil exports, the introduction of stringent capital controls, the reopening of foreign companies under Russian ownership or management, and the imposition of ruble debt repayment schemes. By summer 2022, the ruble had appreciated more than other major currencies relative to the dollar. The government was running a budget surplus of over 10%, and international lending institutions upgraded forecasts for the 2022 contraction of the Russian economy. The resilience of the Russian economy shined the light back onto questions about the sustainability of the West's comprehensive sanctions. However, it also raised questions about the long-term costs to Russia of severe, persistent inflation, the limits of protectionism and diversification from dollar-based trading, the drawdown rates of inventories and manufactured goods and currency reserves, the volatility of energy prices and drop in oil production, and the hollowing out of domestic research and development. Although the Kremlin seemed to survive the initial economic onslaught, the worst may still come. Yet, for all the attention paid to the impact of sanctions and the effectiveness of Russian countermeasures, there has been little direct evidence of success at changing the Kremlin's strategic behavior.
Мы ничего не начали с точки зрения военных действий, а пытаемся только закончить. Изолировать Россию, сделать это невозможно. Ни газ не будем поставлять, ни нефть, ни уголь. Абсолютно тупое решение. Мерзни, мерзни, волчий хвост.
Threats of Western sanctions repeatedly fell on deaf ears in Moscow, compelling Washington and Brussels to follow through with implementation to preserve regulations both at home and abroad. Even the comprehensive sanctions failed to reverse the Kremlin's noxious policies in Ukraine, both preceding and following Moscow's military incursion in 2022. By the same token, Moscow's efforts at weaponizing energy by slashing gas supplies to Europe have been met by staunch resistance, reinvigorated and expanded commitments to NATO, and greater determination to overcome import dependency on Moscow. But judging the effectiveness of the West's sanctions on Russia requires looking beyond just their stated objectives. Sanctions are often marred by unintended consequences. They can boomerang or backfire by reinforcing the target's resolve and efforts at scapegoating. There is evidence, for example, that US-EU sanctions have provoked rally-around-the-flag effects for the Putin regime, fueling anti-Western and nationalist sentiments, feeding Kremlin propaganda, and reinforcing popular support for trigger events such as the annexation of Crimea. Others find that the informal nature of the Putin system drives self-interested Russian oligarchs to become more dependent and responsive to the Kremlin as their wealth is threatened by Western sanctions. Similarly, respected opinion polls consistently reveal that the Russian public is becoming less concerned about the political and economic costs imposed by Western sanctions, especially when those costs land outside of Moscow. Instead, they regard them mostly as an effort to humiliate Russia and remain supportive of the Kremlin's contemporary responses to Western pressure. Sanctions can also accelerate the path to conflict. Research reveals that they can precipitate rather than avert war when imposed by democracies, as the lower costs relative to military action signal weak resolve to an adversary, while locking in domestic pressure to follow through with military force. Alternatively, targets that are convinced they will inevitably face the pain of sanctions can be prone to undertake preventive territorial aggression, as well as strategic risks to foreclose the expected costs and enhance future self-reliance. Since 2014, for example, Russia's broader coercive posture spiked in response to Western sanctions, varying across issue areas, regions, and targets. Discourse from Russian elites consistently drew links between Western sanctions and Moscow's assertiveness in Syria and Iran, as well as other forms of asymmetrical retaliation. Although the Kremlin's counter-sanctions seemed to hurt Russia more than Europe, the willingness to incur such costs were conveyed to sympathetic international and domestic audiences as evidence of Moscow's resolve to stand up to illegitimate foreign pressure and intervention in Russian society. The indirect effects of sanctions are baked into the Russian view of modern warfare. Whereas Western convention treats sanctions as a substitute or precursor for violent military conflict, Russian strategic thought increasingly regards them as instruments for waging long-term competition, blurring a clear distinction between peace and war. At the nub of this new generation warfare are a growing number of non-military tools which can be used to manipulate the decision-making of an adversary during peacetime, crisis, or conflict. To Russian planners, sanctions constitute an important policy instrument used opportunistically to target an adversary's perceptions and strategic calculus, as well as to manage its reactions.
Sanction Russian banks.
Ein Sanktionspaket
of economic sanctions.
The sanctions are here to stay. This is time for us for resolve and not for appeasement.
It is precisely this disconnect that makes the persistence and escalation of sanctions between the West and Russia such a risk. Unlike the nuclear realm, sanctions do not present immediate, mutually understood, self-reinforcing existential threats, nor have they been the focal point of robust strategic dialogue for decades. As a result, Russia and the West have developed different standards, sensitivities, and goals when it comes to sanctions. These divergences risk not only confusing threats across different policy realms, but also blurring triggers for escalation. As the number of policy issue areas implicated in reciprocal sanctions increases, the interaction across them becomes less straightforward. Understanding risky versus opportunistic behavior and permissible responses becomes more and more challenging, thus complicating the pursuit of competitive strategies. This not only can distort incentives for reaching a ceasefire between Ukrainian and Russian forces, but can raise the prospects that Moscow and the West blunder into broader conflict, tearing asunder established norms and confidence-building processes needed to reground future Euro-Atlantic stability.
Given the fog surrounding respective approaches to sanctions and war, U.S. and Russian policymakers ought to jettison complacency surrounding the status quo and focus on creating barriers to unintended escalation short of employing direct military force. This can begin with greater strategic empathy, understanding not only what is driving the other's behavior, but also how it assesses costs, benefits, risks, and pathways to direct confrontation. To be clear, the burden here is less about accepting the other's objectives or ending strategic competition altogether than it is about appreciating the strategies or ways behind the other's sanctions posture and the specific risks of inadvertent escalation.